Are profit cycles encouraging enough? To answer these questions, we have an incredibly high-powered panel to discuss the constant friction between the central government and the opposition, and it's one of the big challenges for the Indian economy. While the government accuses opposition parties of not cooperating and passing legislation that's critical for future economic growth, the opposition claims that government politics have widened the gap between rich and poor and failed to create employment and income growth. Where is the right balance? Please join me in welcoming Jayant Sinha, Chairperson of Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, Manish Tiwari, MP Congress, moderated by Rahul Kawal, News Director, BIZTAK and India Today, Executive Director, Business.The.
Hello and welcome at the India Today Budget Roundtable. We want to spend some time talking about the political economy. We've had an opportunity to dissect budget numbers. We've heard what corporate India is feeling about the current state of the Indian economy. But economics is also about political choices. And we've got two really sharp minds who look at economic policy making, especially in a political context. Mr. Jayant Sinha, welcome. Thank you very much, Mr. Manish Tiwari. He's come down specifically from Punjab in the middle of a campaign for this, so we really appreciate you taking out time, and thank you. I want to start by asking you, Jayantji, at the outset about the political choices that you think the finance minister and the Modi government have made. And this is in the context of the critique of the budget, which is that you're looking at the future pipeline for job creation, whereas a lot of economists, including the likes of, say, an Abhijit Banerjee or an Arvind Subramaniam, who was here at the budget roundtable earlier, say people need help now. If they need a life jacket at this moment, you're showing them the shore and saying, we'll get you there and then you'll be fine. They're drowning right now.
So Rahul, very glad to be on the show and to be with my colleague and very distinguished member of the Finance Committee, Shri Manish Tiwari ji. This budget has addressed all the needs that you mentioned. Because not only have we provided in the past and will continue to provide support for vulnerable populations who need a lifeline now, which of course we are doing, and we've done it in a very impressive way during the COVID pandemic. 3 lakh crores spent on Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, crores of people supported through Narega, where we've spent over 1 lakh crores, the fertilizer subsidy being at 1.4 lakh crores this fiscal year. So wherever vulnerable populations have needed support, this budget and the previous budget and all budgets so far have gone very, very extensively through the process of supporting vulnerable populations. But it is important now that we are going through the COVID pandemic and we are reaching, hopefully, the conclusion of it, that we also turn the chapter and we move on to job creation. So along with support of the vulnerable populations, and it's not either or, Rahul, it's and. There is an and the and is now for job creation, the investments that are coming into capital expenditure, 7.5 lakh crores, the support that we are giving to the digital economy, to the startup ecosystem, and very importantly to the green economy, are all focused on creating jobs for the middle class, for the young people, and for people who want to get a productive start on their lives. So it's both support to the vulnerable populations through all of these extensive welfare programs that we've been running very successfully, as well as providing now the support and the encouragement to create high quality jobs in the more advanced and in the more important parts of the economy. And I'll conclude by just saying, please don't forget the production linked incentive schemes for 14 sectors through which we think we will create some 60 lakh jobs through the support of 1 lakh crores worth of incentives.
Manishji, if one were to look at the recent Modi budget and compare this with budgets presented when the UPA was in power, politically, two things come out strong. One is that the government is taking the call of cutting down sectoral spends, even if it is in very popular sectors, and concentrating its expenditure gunpowder on for example, piped water, which they think in a few years will be transformational for people's lives, or capital expenditure on infrastructure projects, which again the government believes has a massive multiplier effect. unlike what was happening at the UPA time, where you had a lot of different sectors which were getting marginal increases in allocation. Therefore, your expenditure, gunpowder, was staggered over more options. Therefore, there's lesser to show tangibly at the end of a, say, 3-4 year time cycle. How do you respond to the political messaging in the government's economic decision making?
Well, Rahul, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's always a privilege to be on a panel with Mr. Jayant Sinha. As you put it, the quintessential conundrum is the life jacket or the shore. And unfortunately, the government has decided to exchange the life jacket for the shore, which is going to create a huge amount of pain and, add to the existing pain in the economy. Let me very briefly highlight the 3 challenges and then come to as to why the budget does not address it. The first challenge, of course, remains jobs, right? You have unemployment at a 7.1% unemployment rate, but that does not really tell the whole story. The whole story really is that there are about 40.6 crore people who are employed currently in India across various sectors. If you go by global benchmarks, the global benchmark is 60% of the population. This means that you have to ramp up employment to 80 crores. Now, ramping up employment to 80 crores, is an insurmountable challenge. And I don't think the budget even goes in that direction. The second most important challenge is that the income inequality is growing. As various reports have pointed out, that, possibly 9 or 72 Indians hold as much wealth as 552 million Indians. Now, so therefore, and in this COVID-19 pandemic, this income inequality has got exacerbated. The third real problem is the K-shaped recovery. So while you have the larger corporates in the public sector units, in the organized sector, which have been able to come back on an incremental path of growth, the MSME sector, which really accounts for the bulk of employment, has not really been able to alleviate that stress. And you have 50 lakh MSME units which have closed permanently. Now, just let me make the last point with regard to Capex spending, which government thinks is the magic bullet. Now, if you look at fiscal 19 and 20, your capital expenditure actually went up by 29% in FY21, and it went up by 34.5% in the financial year 22. And it is 35% now as compared to the previous fiscal. But has this really generated, or has this translated in alleviating stress in the economy? The answer is no. So therefore, clearly the magic bullet is not working. And the supply side economics, unfortunately, is not doing the trick. Till the time you do not have a consumption-led economy picking up again, I'm afraid that these numbers which the government has put out will not alleviate the pain in the real economy.
Let's discuss the alphabet soup for a bit, Mr. Sinha, because when the principal economic advisor was describing the economic survey, he mentioned a W-shaped recovery. A lot of very sharp economic minds actually suggest that to be a misrepresentation, saying that what we're seeing is a K-shaped recovery, which essentially means the rich have got really rich, the poor are getting much poorer, and that's the direction in which this economy is going. And Manish Tiwari makes the point that you haven't done enough to ensure that those at the absolute bottom of the economic pyramid are given the succor that they need. So the shore isn't good enough. They want a life jacket. And this business of 200 million jobs being required, the global population for those who are employed versus the Indian average, that's not being addressed head on.
So Rahul, I am neither an economist nor a lawyer by training. I'm an engineer by training. So I take a very practical view on these matters. I don't necessarily get into the letters or the alphabets. I just look forward to what needs to happen. And when we drive a car, we don't drive using the rear view mirror. We drive using the windshield. And that's what we have to focus on, not what has happened. Yes, it is entirely true, and this is true around the world, that the entire global economy and the Indian economy as well, and the people of India have suffered through a once-in-a-century pandemic. It is absolutely true. And when you look at what has happened in the pandemic, yes, it has damaged us in terms of jobs, it has damaged us in terms of economic growth, it has been extremely tragic in terms of lives lost. So we've had a very, very difficult and challenging time throughout the global economy because of the pandemic. But that's looking backwards. That's the rear view mirror. What we now need to do is we now need to look forward through the windshield and say, what is happening practically on the ground? Are things turning around? Is there an inflection point? And what we are seeing is that there is a very clear turning point. There is a very clear inflection that's happening. GDP growth this fiscal year is 9.2%. And if you look at all the high frequency indicators, the forward-looking indicators, GST collections are at a record high. We are seeing exports at a record high. We are seeing startups growing in an unprecedented way. We are seeing capital flows into India that are at unprecedented levels. The stock markets are booming, obviously, because they're forward-looking indicators. So my suggestion is that rather than get into this alphabet soup about one point in time, which is where we are right now, one point in time, we have to look at the trends. We have to look forward. We have to see how India is positioned globally. We are going to be the fastest growing large economy in the world. And if we look at the investments that are going in, the kinds of policies that have been put in place, I think all of these are positioning India extremely well for the future. And that's called looking forward, looking into the future.
You make an important point about the direction in which we're headed. And there, Mr. Tiwari, do you concede that UPA governments in their economic policy were often accused of populism? There's a big election happening. Uttar Pradesh, your own state, Punjab, Uttarakhand, Goa, Manipur. There's virtually nothing in the budget which would suggest that it's a budget with an eye on assembly elections which happen literally weeks from now. In the UPA time, multiple things happened which seemed more populist. The government is saying capital expenditure is important because the multiplier effect is between 2 and 2.5 on every rupee that's spent, the impact on the GDP. Whereas the kind of revenue expenditure which you're advocating be pushed has a multiplier effect of only 0.90 to 0.99, and therefore the multiplier is much lesser. This is longer term directional economic policy making, which is good for the new India story going forward.
Well, Rahul, I didn't want to look into the rear view mirror, but since you want to sort of go down that path and look into the past, let me remind you that during those 10 years when the UPA was in government, the Indian economy grew at an average rate of 7.8 to 8% year on year for 10 long years. And this is notwithstanding the global economic meltdown, the Eurozone crisis, the headwinds because of extremely high crude oil prices. And I just mentioned 2 or 3 of those challenges. And the fact remains that even the finance minister in her last budget speech acknowledged that during those 10 years, 271 million people were lifted out of poverty. So therefore, those are hard numbers acknowledged not only by us, but acknowledged by even a successor finance minister. So therefore, under those circumstances, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. And the reality is that today, 4.6 crore people have been pushed back into poverty. Now, has it happened only because of the pandemic? The answer is no, because unfortunately this slide started in 2016 with demonetization, and then you had a very tardily implemented goods and service tax regime, which had a crippling effect on the informal sector. And so therefore, by the time you came to 2019, and if you recall the figures of H1 of 2019-20, credit offtake was down by 87%. These are all numbers before the COVID-19 pandemic, devastated economies around the world. And even today, when the government talks about a 9.2% GDP rate of growth, the fact is that we are looking at that number from a very low base. So the real GDP growth could be as low as 1.9%, because minus 7.3% and 9.2%, if you look at the real GDP growth, it's about 1.2, 1.3%. Having said that, all of us are invested in the economic recovery of India. My only point of departure from what the finance minister is doing, she feels that supply side economics will work. They have given huge amount of tax incentives to corporate India, lowered corporate income tax. And this all happened again before the COVID-19 pandemic kicked in. But it's not really translated into the economic engine really starting up or the cylinders firing again. And this emphasis on public expenditure as possibly the way to start the economy, frankly, if you look at the experience of the last 2 years, doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, so let's deal with it, because it's not just about announcing allocations, it's about being able to spend what you've announced that you will. And Manish Tiwari is spot on when he says that if you look at the government's own numbers, everything else is rhetoric and talk. The government's own numbers suggest you haven't been able to spend what you promised you would. And if you're asking for a 35% increase in the total capital expenditure, given the inability and the problems, genuine problems associated with spends, how will you be able to walk that talk, Jensen?
Rahul, let me address that question, capital expenditure. But before that, let me correct a misimpression that seems to be getting created. And that misimpression is that we are cutting back on support to vulnerable populations. We are cutting back on support for basic consumption. And we are just taking that money and we are putting it into capital expenditure. That is not true. We've had extraordinarily high levels of support. As I said, we spent 3 lakh crores on the Food Security Act. We spent over 1 lakh crores on Narega. We spent 1.4 lakh crores on the fertilizer subsidy. We have provided lakhs of crores of support through credit guarantee schemes to the MSME sector. We have spent a lot of money on the production linked incentive program. So we are providing a tremendous amount of support where it is required. And going into the next financial year, remember Narega is a demand program. Yes, we brought the allocation down because we expect the economy to roar back to life, in which case there will be less need for Narega. But if there is need for Narega, obviously that spending will happen. If there's need for food subsidies, obviously that spending will happen. So this is, the numbers as they have come down are just reflecting the fact that the economy is coming back to normal and there will be less need for support to vulnerable populations. So it's not either or, Rahul. I want to just correct that. It is and. Wherever support is required, that support is being provided to vulnerable populations. And where we have to provide encouragement for the growth of the economy, we are doing that. Now let's come back to capital expenditure. As far as capital expenditure is concerned, if there has been any delay in spending the money, it is primarily because of the restrictions and the lockdowns that have happened because of first the second wave, which by the way was in this financial year, and then Omicron, which was also in this financial year. Otherwise, we've been rolling out spending, rolling out all of these infrastructure projects very, very quickly. You know that highways are being built, airports are being built, ports are being built at a very rapid clip, and you can see them on the ground. I can see them in Jharkhand, I can see them in Uttar Pradesh. I can see all of this happening very, very quickly.
Manish Tiwari also raised the issue of inequality. According to the Oxfam inequality report, the number of people who were pushed into poverty in 2020 was 4.6 crore, whereas the number of billionaires rose from 14 to 102. Now, inequality is a global problem, and the pandemic has exacerbated this globally. But in the Indian context, for a government which says we are a Aam Aadmi ki Sarkar, these numbers speak very loudly. The Ambanis and the Adanis are getting much richer, and those who are poor are getting poorer.
Rahul, these are a natural byproduct. These numbers are, first of all, a snapshot in time, and they're the natural byproduct of what it took to stimulate the economy through the pandemic. So when we provide support, capital markets boom because of liquidity, because of what the Fed is doing, etc. Obviously, people who have assets, people who have large sort of holdings in various companies in the stock market are going to see an increase in their wealth. That was not because of government policy. That was because of easy liquidity that central banks around the world have pumped into the global economy. Even to this date, if you look at how much the central banks are pumping into the global economy, they are pumping some $300 billion a year. When that happens, there is going to be asset inflation. There is going to be a situation where stock markets and asset classes are going to increase. And when that happens, it is but natural that it begins to appear as if some people are doing extremely well. We've seen the volatility that exists. You've seen Facebook was up one day and it was down the next day. This volatility is there because of the liquidity and the easy money policies being followed by central banks. banks, which, by the way, was exactly right, and that was the only way to get through a once-in-a-century pandemic. And let me remind you that the Spanish flu, when it came about, set the stage for a Great Depression that followed in the 1930s. So it was a very good idea to try and avoid those kinds of outcomes, and this is what happens when these policies take effect with a lag.
Manish Tiwari, do you agree with Jayant Sinha when he says, net, if you look at how the Indian economy is placed now, vis-a-vis countries that opened their purse strings and were very fiscally imprudent, we're better placed, possibly at a point of inflection, capacity utilization now in the mid-70s, so it's only natural that the tax cuts that the government gave will lead to private investment kicking in. It's only a matter of time. And just opening purse strings doesn't necessarily help, because when this happened during the time, just after the Spanish flu, it did lead to the Great Depression.
Well, I don't think, first of all, the global economy in the 21st century is very similar to the structure of the global economy, back in 1918, 100 years ago. So I think maybe that comparison is not very appropriate. Having said that, if you look around the world, what did most governments around the world do? They gave direct income support to the people, because that is the direct income support which was required at that point in time. And even direct income support to small businesses to be able to sustain themselves. What did the government of India do? The government of India actually gave credit lines. So essentially saying that you take credit, pay interest on it, and therefore if you are able to get through, well and good. Otherwise, of course, you will have to service the debt burden. So there was a fundamental difference in how many developed countries around the world addressed the pandemic or the economic aspects of pandemic, and as to how the government of India decided to address it. Number two, you see, all the numbers that Mr. Sinha talked about, and those numbers are correct with regard to the support which they have given to vulnerable sections of society, and maybe that was required, but they are also indicative of the continuing stress in the economy. Now, if you were to just look at two numbers, Manrega demand, and Manrega is a household-driven program, 21.1 million households asked for Manrega work in the November of 2021. That figure went up to 24.7 million households in the December of 2021, and this is just 2 months back. So this is indicative of the fact that irrespective of whatever stimulus the government is applying, it has not been able to catalyze the economy. As I was earlier pointing out, that capital expenditure, this is not the first time it is being raised. This is the third time it is being raised year after year, and in the range of 25 to 35%. It's not translating into either enhanced employment on the ground, or neither is it able to alleviate the stress. So obviously, there is a missing piece. And I think the government should really apply itself to that missing piece. I guess when we have the mandarins of the finance ministry before our committee on the 23rd and the 24th of February, some of these issues are going to be raised, because these are the hard questions which need to be asked.
In the few minutes that we have left, I want to spend some time, Mr. Sinha, talking about defense expenditure in this country. And Manish Tiwari is very passionate about the whole defense sector. Now, if you look at the trend line, say in comparison with the 80s and the 90s, spending on defense as a part of as a ratio to our GDP is coming down. The trend line is downward facing. The other problem is that we simply aren't being able to spend on weapon purchase as much as we need to, given the fact that we have an active line of actual control at this moment, given the kind of investments the Chinese PLA is making on military modernization. That is one of the biggest threat India faces, and that's not being adequately addressed by a government whose central pivot is that we will take care of India's security interests. But numbers speak louder, as I said, than any rhetoric. On defense spending, numbers don't match your rhetoric.
Rahul, you're touching on something that is probably for all of us as patriotic Indians, the number one priority, which is India's national security. And here I'd like to just point out to you that it's not just a question of numbers. It's much more a question of how you spend the money and the productivity with which you spend the money. And there you will see that there has been extraordinary reform. Apart from the Chief of Defense Staff and so on, the structural changes in the way in which our armed forces are now commanded, you look at the way in which we are building up our Atmanirbharta, our ability to manufacture domestically, what we are doing in terms of opening up defense research to the private sector and particularly for startups. If you also at the same time look at some of the more advanced technologies, Rafale obviously is one example of that, but the S-400 are other sort of weapon systems that we have brought. We are making sure that the rupee goes as far as possible through these productivity and efficiency enhancement measures. And in doing so, we are, of course, making sure that India is as strong as possible. I'll just conclude, Rahul, with one final point. Please don't underestimate the importance of infrastructure to our national security. Border roads, railways, airports closed to our borders where we can, if necessary, use them for those purposes. All of that vital infrastructure has also been geared up. The Rohtang Pass, the tunnels that we have built going into Ladakh, all of these are seen as infrastructure, but they are equally importantly strengthening our national security.
Manish Tiwari, you look at defense budgets very carefully. The government's best defense is don't look at the defense to GDP ratio. Look instead at how we use every rupee that we spend. On your watch, during the UPA government, there's a lot of wasteful expenditure. By pushing the idea of an Atmanirbhar Bharat in the defense sector, 2/3 of the money spent on weapon purchases will now be made in India, which in a long-term cycle is going to change India's dependence on importing defense systems, which you should have done but never did.
Well, as Keynes said, in the long term, all of us would be dead. But this is a subject which obviously requires a far more amount of time. But there's a very interesting report by the Committee of Estimates, which was headed by the former president of the BJP, Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, in the previous parliament. And it actually traced the trend line of defense to GDP ratio. And defense to GDP ratio actually declined steadily every year between 2014 and 2019. In fact,
it's been declining from the mid-80s.
In fact, in the year 2019, it was lower than what it was even in the pre-1962 days. So therefore, there is a problem out there which you cannot brush under the carpet. Even today, the GDP to defense spending ratio is about 2.02%, but that's a part of the problem. Even if you look at the capital expenditure, which between 2013-14 has gone up from about 56,000 crores to about 150, about a 73% increase. But then if you look at how it gets compounded annually, it only comes to a 5% annual compounded rate if you take into effect.
He's talking about bang for the buck. Don't look at the actual number. Look at how wisely that money is spent.
The fact is, Rahul, that you almost have an active two-front situation at the moment. There is a huge amount of attrition in terms of defense expenditure which is taking place. And unfortunately, government has been extremely evasive about telling Parliament as to what has been the expenditure been on this current standoff with China from April 2020 onwards. And this is completely in contrast to what had happened during Operation Parakram. In fact, if you look at the answers of the then Defense Minister, Mr. George Fernandez, who had come back, government was very, very transparent about what the cost of that deployment has been. So I think we'll have to hold our horses. We'll have to wait and see as to when these numbers come out, what do they really add up to. I don't think in actual terms, primarily because we are so squeezed, we are able to give that emphasis on defense expenditure. And that's why I've been repeatedly arguing that we are facing a conundrum. Either we bring down our national security challenges or we up our defense expenditure. With the current national security challenges that we face and the current level of defense expenditure, the two don't match.
That's a strong counter by Manish Tiwari. And the fact is, especially, this is not Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister. He was a pacifist, not necessarily a man who'd say, "Ghar ke andar aake muh todenge," etc. Given what the Prime Minister said on national security and the aggressive stance that's seen, That aggression is not seen in budget numbers. This idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India, is a longer term idea and it's most welcome. Our challenges are now, when the Chief of Defence Staff, while he was there, was asked about the possibility of war, he said, you can't, it's not happening right now, but you can't deny that possibility. The army chief said exactly the same thing. Given the immediacy of the challenge, your numbers don't match threat perception.
Rahul, I wouldn't agree with that because I know that the Honorable Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, the Honorable Raksha Mantri ji, all of them are absolutely attuned to whatever our defense needs are and are very clear that our armed forces will get all the support that they need. So I don't think we need to doubt their intent and their resolve to provide whatever resources are required. As far as the situation is concerned, we have been spending whatever is necessary and we will obviously continue to spend whatever is necessary. But I will come back again to what I said earlier. It's all about how you spend the money and what you spend the money on. And I think there we have made the right decisions and we have ensured that our troops have exactly what they need to be able to be combat ready and to take on any adversary.
You were involved.
Rahul, may I just make a 10-second point? Sorry to interrupt. Way back in 1999 when the Kargil conflict happened, General VP Malik made a very famous statement. He said, we will fight with whatever we have. And that remains the situation even today. General Malik, when he in Chandigarh released my book recently, in fact emphasized the same point once again, saying essentially there has been no change between 1991 and 2021. And if the push comes to a shove, we will fight with whatever we have.
We have time only for one final question. And I ask you this because you were involved in the aborted attempt to disinvest Air India. And now finally Air India is in the hands of the Tatas, and thank God for that. But what's happened on the disinvestment target set in the budget is that 2 years ago, it was 2.1 lakh crores. Then it came down to 1.75 lakh crores. Now it's down to 65,000 crore rupees. Now, two things could happen. One, you're under committing and hope to over deliver. The other is, has the government lost its mojo and appetite and desire to get rid of companies like BPCL, for example? If that were to go through, then the target would at least be, say, 85,000 crore rupees or so, whereas it's only 65,000 crore rupees, and people are wondering, why is the government's target, forget what they do ultimately, why is the target not aggressive enough?
Honorable Finance Minister has been very clear on this matter, which is that our strategy and our intent is very clear, which is that government needs to be only in a few strategic sectors with a few companies, and in all the other non-strategic sectors, we will divest. Then we have to go through a difficult and complicated process, which of course I've been part of with Air India. When we tried to take Air India out in 2018, 2019, the challenge was there were no buyers willing to step in and take it on. Now, of course, we've had buyers who've come in and therefore, the process has gone through. But to take a government asset like an Air India or any other government company and to prepare it and get it ready so that a private bidder, a company will come in and take it over is a lengthy, complicated process, and we have to be mindful of all of the issues that have to be resolved before we can do that. That obviously is something that requires us to be prudent and conservative, and I think that's what you're seeing reflected in the numbers.
I hope, Manish Tiwari, as we end, you're privately thankful that Air India has been sold off to the Tatas and that your government in the 10 years that you were in power didn't have the appetite. The Vajpayee government pushed whatever disinvestment they did. It became politically expensive. Your government, despite the likes of Dr. Manmohan Singh believing in the need for privatization, simply didn't have the gumption to push through what the Modi government's now pushing through.
No, well, since your monitor is showing 0000, I will not go down this street, but there's a conceptual difference that we have on privatization of the public sector. And insofar as Air India is also concerned, if I am instructed correctly, the Air India disinvestment is also facing a legal challenge in the Mumbai High Court, and we'll wait and see as to how it plays itself out.
He didn't answer. He's a lawyer. He didn't want to say, yes, I'm thankful that Air India is gone, and we should have done it, but we couldn't. I can't say this on camera.
Actually,
but let's
Rahul,
talk about it once we get away.
Rahul, since you're being provocative, I have been a consistent opponent of the disinvestment of Air India, and if you want to do a standalone show on that, Jainji and I had done at one point in time when he was the Minister for Civil Aviation. I am more than happy to be your guest.
So we will have to set this up again, because to talk about the political economy is very critical, because as I said at the start, all economics is essentially politics, right? And you've seen two different points of view during the session at the India Today Budget Roundtable. I thank you very much. Manish Tiwari, for coming down specially from Punjab for this session. And thank you very much, Jayanji, for participating in this conversation. Thank you.